Andrew Carnegie had just finished recounting his pre-war meetings with the German Kaiser, whom he hoped would be an apostle of peace. But in the summer of 1914, as he reviewed his manuscript, the world had been plunged into an unprecedented war. This is his first-hand account of his hopes for a new leader at the dawn of the conflict. In the last year of peace, the richest man in the world put his life to paper. He was 78 years old, the retired King of Steel, who had built a personal fortune equal to 3% of America's entire GDP. As Europe's empires prepared to bleed each other white, he wrote a private message intended for the future, but aimed squarely at the present, at President Woodrow Wilson. It was a history of his own ascent, a blueprint for how a man, or a nation, escapes a dying system and seizes the future. He laid out, in his own words, the making of a master of capital. This is not a history lesson. This is his private autobiography. Hal, Story Arc 1, The Radical Forge.
If the story of any man's life, truly told, must be interesting, then perhaps my own account will not unduly disappoint. I intend to tell my story not as one posturing before the public, but as if in the midst of my own people, to whom I can speak with the utmost freedom. To begin, then, I was born in Dunfermline, Scotland, in the attic of a small one-story house on the 25th of November, 1835. I was, as the saying is, of poor but honest parents, of good kith and kin. Dunfermline was the centre of the damask trade, and my father, William Carnegie, was a damask weaver. He was the son of Andrew Carnegie, after whom I was named. My grandfather was well known throughout the district for his wit and humour, his genial nature, and irrepressible spirits. He was the head of the lively ones of his day. Upon my return to Dunfermline, after 14 years away, an old man tottered across the room to me. He laid a trembling hand on my head and said, "And you are the grandson of Andrew Carnegie. Aemon, I have seen the day when your grandfather and I could have hallowed any reasonable man out of his judgment. I think my optimistic nature, my ability to laugh through life, must have been inherited from this delightful old masquerading grandfather. A sunny disposition is worth more than a fortune. On my mother's side, the grandfather was even more marked. Thomas Morrison was a friend of the reformer William Cobbett, a contributor to his Register, and a born orator. Old men in Dunfermline still speak of him as one of the finest and ablest men they had known. He was the publisher of The Precursor, thought to be the first radical paper in Scotland. I have read his writings. 70 years ago, he published a pamphlet entitled Head-ication versus Hand-ication, insisting on the importance of technical, practical skill. It ended with the words, "I thank God that in my youth I learned to make and mend shoes." My grandfather Morrison was a keen politician and the head of the advanced wing of the Radical Party in the district. As a child, I was nurtured on exciting themes: the grandeur of the American Republic, a home for freemen; the denunciations of monarchy and aristocratic government, of privilege in all its forms. As a child, I could have slain a king, duke, or lord, and considered their deaths a service to the state. Such is the influence of childhood's earliest associations. It was long before I could speak respectfully of any privileged class. There was always the sneer behind it for mere pedigree, a fraud strutting in borrowed plumes. I remember as if it were yesterday being awakened by a tap at the window. Men had come to inform my parents that my uncle, Bailey Morrison, had been thrown into jail. He had dared to hold a meeting which had been forbidden. The sheriff, with the aid of soldiers, had arrested him. Serious trouble was feared, for the populace threatened to rescue him. He was induced by the town's provost to step to the window and beg the people to retire. This he did, saying, "If there be a friend of the good cause here tonight, let him fold his arms." They did so, and then, after a pause, he said, "Now, depart in peace." My uncle, like all our family, was a moral force man, strong for obedience to law, but radical to the core. You can imagine when all this was going on in public, how bitter were the words that passed in private. I only echoed what I heard at home. Nursed amid such surroundings, I developed into a violent young Republican whose motto was "Death to Privilege." Tsar, Story Arc 2, The Romance of the Abbey. I was supremely fortunate in my birthplace. Where one is born is very important. Ruskin truly observes that every bright boy in Edinburgh is influenced by the sight of the castle. So is the child of Dunfermline by its noble abbey, the Westminster of Scotland, the ruins of the great monastery, and of the palace where kings were born still stand. There, too, is Pittencrieff Glen, and the ruins of King Malcolm's Tower, from the old ballad of Sir Patrick Spens. The king sits in Dunfermline Tower, drinking the bluid red wine. The tomb of the Bruce is in the centre of the abbey. St. Margaret's tomb is near. Fortunate indeed, the child who first sees the light in that romantic town. The child, privileged to develop amid such surroundings, absorbs poetry and romance with the air he breathes. A man whose influence over me cannot be overestimated was my Uncle Lauder. My father was constantly at work, but my uncle, a shopkeeper, had leisure. He found his chief solace in the companionship of his son, George, and myself. He possessed an extraordinary gift for dealing with children. He taught us British history by imagining each of the monarchs in a certain place upon the walls of the room. Thus, for me, King John sits to this day above the mantelpiece, signing the Magna Charta. And in our list, the grand Republican monarch Oliver Cromwell appeared, writing his message to the Pope, informing His Holiness that if he did not cease persecuting the Protestants, the thunder of Great Britain's cannon would be heard in the Vatican. It was from my uncle I learned all that I know of the early history of Scotland, of Wallace and Bruce and Burns. I can truly say that there was then and there created in me a vein of Scottish prejudice, or patriotism, which will cease to exist only with life. Wallace, of course, was our hero. Sad was the day when a wicked big boy at school told me that England was far larger than Scotland. I went to the uncle who had the remedy. "Not at all," he said. "If Scotland were rolled out flat as England, Scotland would be the larger. But would you have the Highlands rolled down?" Oh, never. Later, the greater population of England was forced upon me, and again to the uncle I went. "Yes," he said, 7-1. But there were more than that odds against us at Bannockburn. And again there was joy in my heart, joy that there were more Englishmen there, since the glory was the greater. My uncle set great value upon recitation. In our little frocks, sleeves rolled up, with laths for swords, my cousin and I were kept constantly reciting Norval and Glenalvon, Roderick Dhu and James Fitzjames. The betrayal of Wallace was his trump card, which never failed to cause our little hearts to sob. There were 2 roads home from my uncle's house, one along the eerie churchyard of the abbey, and the other along the lighted streets. When it became necessary for me to go home, my uncle, with a wicked pleasure, would ask which way I was going. Thinking what Wallace would do, I always replied I was going by the abbey. I often passed through the dark arch of the abbey with my heart in my mouth, falling back upon the thought of what Wallace would have done. It is a tower of strength for a boy to have a hero. Story Arc 3: The Coming Revolution. The change from hand loom to steam loom weaving was disastrous to our family. My father did not recognize the impending revolution and was struggling under the old system. His looms sank greatly in value, and it became necessary for that power which never failed in any emergency, my mother, to step forward and endeavor to repair the family fortune. She opened a small shop in Moody Street and contributed to the revenues. Though slender, they sufficed at that time to keep us in comfort and respectable. It is here that my earliest recollections of business begin. Soon after, the accounts of the various people who dealt with the shop were entrusted to my keeping, so that I became acquainted in a small way with business affairs even in childhood. But I remember that shortly after this, I began to learn what poverty meant. Dreadful days came when my father took the last of his webs to the great manufacturer. I saw my mother anxiously awaiting his return to know whether a new web was to be obtained, or if a period of idleness was upon us. It was burnt into my heart then that my father, though neither abject, mean, nor vile, as Burns has it, had nevertheless to beg a brother of the earth to give him leave to toil. And then and there came the resolve that I would cure that when I got to be a man. We were not, however, reduced to anything like poverty compared with many of our neighbors. I do not know to what lengths of privation my mother would not have gone that she might see her 2 boys wearing large white collars and trimly dressed. In religious matters, we were not much hampered. My father had risen and left the Presbyterian Church one day when the minister preached the doctrine of infant damnation. This was shortly after I had made my appearance. Father could not stand it. He said, "If that be your religion and that your God, I seek a better religion and a nobler God." He left the church, never to return, but he did not cease to attend various other churches. I saw him enter the closet every morning to pray, and that impressed me. He was indeed a saint. All sects became to him as agencies for good. He had discovered that theologies were many, but religion was one. Story Arc 4: The First Venture. One of the chief enjoyments of my childhood was the keeping of pigeons and rabbits. I am grateful every time I think of the trouble my father took to build a suitable house for these pets. Our home became headquarters for my young companions. My mother used to say that the first step to keeping her boys on the right path was to make home pleasant. There was nothing she and my father would not do to please us. My first business venture was securing my companion's services for a season as an employer. The compensation was that the young rabbits, when such came, should be named after them. The Saturday holiday was generally spent by my flock in gathering food for the rabbits. My conscience reproves me today, looking back, when I think of the hard bargain I drove with my young playmates. Many were content to gather dandelions for a whole season, conditioned upon this unique reward, the poorest return ever made to labor. Alas, what else had I to offer them? Not a penny. I treasure the remembrance of this plan as the earliest evidence of organizing power, upon the development of which my material success in life has hung. A success not to be attributed to what I have known or done myself, but to the faculty of knowing and choosing others who did know better than myself. Precious knowledge, this, for any man to possess. I did not understand steam machinery, but I tried to understand that much more complicated piece of mechanism, man. Stopping at a small Highland inn on a coaching trip in 1898, a gentleman came forward and introduced himself. He was Mr. Mackintosh, the great furniture manufacturer. He said he was one of the boys who had gathered spoil for the rabbits and had one named after him. It may be imagined how glad I was to meet him, the only one of the rabbit boys I have met in after life. I hope to keep his friendship to the last. Handcart, Story Arc 5, The Land of Promise. With the introduction and improvement of steam machinery, trade grew worse and worse in Dunfermline for the small manufacturers. At last, a letter was written to my mother's 2 sisters in Pittsburgh. The idea of our going to them was seriously entertained, not, as I remember hearing my parents say, to benefit their own condition, but for the sake of their 2 young sons. Satisfactory letters were received in reply. The decision was taken. The looms and furniture were to be sold by auction, and my father's sweet voice sang often to mother, brother, and me. To the west, to the west, to the land of the free, where the mighty Missouri rolls down to the sea. It was years before I could feel that the new land could be anything but a temporary abode. My heart was in Scotland. I resembled a little boy I knew who, when in Canada, said he liked it very well for a visit, but he could never live so far away from the remains of Bruce and Wallace. But we were on our way, leaving the old world, with its privileges and its dying trades, for the new. We did not know what was to come. We only knew what we were leaving behind. And for my father, the weaver, and my mother, the shopkeeper, it was everything, the land of promise.
The boy who left Scotland in 1848 to escape a dying industry would become the master of a new one. He arrived in America with nothing and built an industrial empire that would arm the nation for the century to come. The man who learned his first lesson in management by trading the naming rights of rabbits for their fodder would one day negotiate with kings and presidents. As he sat in his library in 1914, with the world he had tried to shape with his fortune and his philosophy of peace descending into war, his autobiography was more than a memory. It was a testament to the brutal, simple logic of capital, that systems die, and that fortunes are made by those who have the foresight to abandon the sinking ship and the nerve to build the new one.
This is not a history lesson. This is my private testament. Arc Y, the boy from Dunfermline. I was born in Dunfermline, Scotland, in a small weaver's cottage. The attic where my family lived had just one room, which served as kitchen, living room, and bedroom for the four of us. My father was a master weaver, a man of good standing in his trade. He believed in the rights of the working man, a chartist who spoke of a better world. But the hum of the hand loom was being silenced by the roar of the factory. Steam-powered mills rose up, and the work for men like my father dried up like a river in summer. I remember the day he came home and said, "There is no more work." The silence of his loom was the sound of our world ending. My mother, she was the one who held us together. While the men debated politics, she faced the practical reality. She opened a small shop in our front room, selling groceries, mending shoes, anything to keep bread on the table. She was the true capitalist of the family. She would say to me, "Andy, look after the pennies, and the pounds will look after themselves." A simple lesson, but it has been the foundation of all that followed. We received a letter from her sisters in America. Pittsburgh, they called it. A place of iron and smoke, but also of opportunity. The decision was made. We sold our loom, our few possessions. It was a kind of death. We were to leave Scotland, the only home we had ever known, and sail for a new world. I was 12 years old. The journey itself was an ordeal. 7 weeks in the steerage of a small sailing ship, the Wiscasset. I remember standing on the deck as the shores of Scotland faded into the mist. I did not cry. I felt that I was leaving a land of ghosts and heading toward a land of substance. We arrived in Allegheny City, across the river from Pittsburgh. The air was thick with coal smoke, a black dust that settled on everything. It was not beautiful. It was hell with the lid taken off. But for us, it was the promised land. My father found work in a cotton mill, but his spirit was broken. He was no longer his own master, but a cog in a machine. I knew then that I would never work for another man in that way. I had to find my own path. My first job was as a bobbin boy in that same mill, earning $1.20 a week. I was small, but I was fast. My mind, however, was already looking beyond the factory walls. I was listening, watching, learning the system. Even in the roar of the machinery, I was searching for the silence, the gap, the opportunity that others missed. That is where fortunes are found. Arc 2. The language of the wire. My escape from the mill came in the form of a messenger boy position at the Pittsburgh Telegraph office. It was a step up, clean work. More importantly, it put me at the center of the city's nervous system. I delivered telegrams to the city's most important men: bankers, iron masters, lawyers. I learned their names, their businesses, their secrets. I made it my business to be the fastest, most reliable boy in the office. But delivering the messages was not enough. I wanted to understand them. The clicking of the telegraph key was a new language, the language of power and money. In my spare moments, I practiced on a spare instrument, teaching my ear to understand the dots and dashes. Most operators had to write down the message as it came in, letter by letter. I was the first in Pittsburgh, perhaps one of the first in the country, to learn to take messages by sound alone. This one skill changed everything. My speed and accuracy caught the attention of Thomas A. Scott, the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division. He was a man who understood systems, a man who saw the future. He offered me a job as his personal telegrapher and secretary. I was 17. Mr. Scott became my mentor. He taught me the railroad business, but more than that, he taught me how to manage men and capital. He once had an opportunity to buy 10 shares in the Adams Express Company for $500. He offered me the chance. $500. It was a fortune, more money than I had ever seen. My mother mortgaged our house to raise the sum. It was her bet, not mine. The first dividend check arrived for $10. I remember staring at it. "Here's the goose that lays the golden eggs," I told my mother. When the Civil War came, Mr. Scott was appointed Assistant Secretary of War, in charge of military transportation and telegraphs. He took me with him to Washington. We were in the eye of the storm. My job was to keep the lines of communication open to the front. I personally rode on the first locomotive to cross the Potomac into Virginia after the tracks were repaired under fire. We were stringing telegraph wire as the armies advanced. I saw firsthand how information, and the speed of its delivery, could win or lose a battle. I saw how a well-run railroad could move an army, and how a broken one could doom it. The war was a terrible, brutal business, but it was also a lesson in logistics and scale. One day, Mr. Scott pointed to a wrecked wooden bridge, burned by the retreating Confederates. "Andy," he said, "the man who replaces all these wooden bridges with iron will make a fortune." That thought did not leave me. The war would end. The country would need to be rebuilt, and it would be rebuilt with iron. Arc 3. Bridges of iron, towers of steel. After the war, I left the railroad. The path forward was clear to me. I took Mr. Scott's advice to heart and founded the Keystone Bridge Company. Our mission was simple: replace every important wooden bridge in America with one made of iron. It was a risk. Iron was expensive, and the engineering was new. Railroad men were conservative. They trusted the wood they knew. I had to become a salesman, a financier, a manager, all at once. Our first great test was the bridge across the Mississippi River at St. Louis, the Eads Bridge. No one had ever spanned a river so wide or with such a powerful current. The project was deemed impossible. We did it. It took years, cost millions, and claimed lives, but it stood. That bridge was our greatest advertisement. If we could conquer the Mississippi, we could bridge anything. The orders flooded in, but even as we built with iron, I saw the next shift coming. It was a new process from England, invented by a man named Henry Bessemer: steel. It was lighter, stronger, and more durable than iron. The future was not iron. It was steel. Railroads would need steel rails. Cities would need steel frames for their new tall buildings. The world would be remade in steel. Most of my partners, comfortable with our success in iron, thought I was mad. I did not try to convince them. I built my own future. I sold my other interests and concentrated everything on one great project, the Edgar Thomson Steelworks, outside of Pittsburgh. I named it after my friend and the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, my biggest potential customer. We built it on a scale no one had ever attempted. We owned the coke fields that fueled the furnaces, the iron ore mines that fed them, the ships and railroads that carried the material. It was a completely integrated system, from raw material to finished rail. We controlled every cost. I was not a technical man. I knew little of metallurgy, but I knew how to find men who did, and I knew how to read a cost sheet. Every morning a report was placed on my desk, showing the output and cost of every single process from the night before. I could tell you which furnace was the most efficient, which manager was performing the best. We drove the price of steel rails down from over $100 a ton to $12. We captured the market not by conspiracy, but by efficiency. We ran the furnaces day and night. We worked the men in 2 shifts, 12 hours each, 7 days a week. It was a brutal, relentless pace. I told my managers, the cost of a product is the first thing to be considered. We were at war, a war of costs. And in that war, we were victorious. The profits were immense, beyond anything I had ever imagined. The goose that laid the golden eggs had become a flock that darkened the sky. Arc 4. The Gospel and the Strike. With this great fortune came a great problem. What was I to do with it? To die rich is to die disgraced. I could not simply pass it on to my heirs to be squandered. I believed wealth was a public trust, to be administered by the wisest for the benefit of all. I called this my gospel of wealth. The man of wealth is a trustee for the poor, bound to consider it his duty to live modestly, and use his surplus revenues in the manner which is best calculated to produce the most beneficial results for the community. The library, the university, the concert hall, these were the tools to elevate the race. But while I was in Scotland, preaching this gospel, the devil's work was being done in my name, back in Pittsburgh. The year was 1892. The union contract at our Homestead Steel Works was up for renewal. My partner and chairman, Henry Clay Frick, was in charge of negotiations. Frick was a man I had trusted, a brilliant manager of coke operations, but a man with no subtlety. He saw the union not as a partner, but as an enemy to be broken. He locked the workers out of the mill and built a fence around it. Fort Frick, they called it. Then he hired 300 Pinkerton agents, a private army, to escort non-union workers into the plant. They came up the river at night on armed barges. The locked-out workers were waiting for them on the riverbank. It was a battle. Men were killed on both sides. The Pinkertons were defeated, humiliated. but the state militia was called in, and the strike was eventually broken. The union was crushed, not just at Homestead, but across the entire steel industry for decades. I was in a castle on a remote Scottish loch. The cables were delayed. I maintained that I did not know the extent of Frick's plans. This is true, but it is not the whole truth. I had given him the authority to act. I had built the system that required costs to be cut. I had created the man who pulled the trigger. The world saw me as a hypocrite, the philanthropist whose wealth was built on the blood of his workers. The stain of Homestead has followed me all my days. It is the one part of the ledger that can never be balanced. I sold the steel company to J.P. Morgan in 1901. He created U.S. Steel, the largest corporation in the world. My personal share was nearly $250 million, paid in gold bonds. I was the richest man in the world, and I was finally free to begin my true life's work, the business of giving it all away.
Andrew Carnegie would spend the last 2 decades of his life in a race against time, trying to give away a fortune larger than the annual budget of the United States government. He built nearly 3,000 public libraries, founded universities, and created the endowment for international peace that still bears his name, all from the profits of a system he perfected and then abandoned. The archive holds another voice, a Venetian merchant who traveled 1,000 years before Carnegie, whose journey to the court of Kublai Khan revealed a world of paper money, burning rocks, and imperial power that dwarfed the kingdoms of Europe. Click here to hear the travels of Marco Polo.